Good afternoon. Your Excellencies, Ambassadors Cohen and Gutmann, Lord Rees, President Jameson, friends and students, welcome to Perry Worldhouse. This is the University of Pennsylvania's home for global engagement. My name is Michael Weisberg, the Deputy Director here at Perry Worldhouse, and we're incredibly excited to host this conversation today with our distinguished guests, Ambassador Gutmann and Ambassador Cohen, and Andrea Mitchell. As you all know, Perry Worldhouse is Penn's hub for global engagement, but very importantly for today, it's one of the manifestations of Ambassador Gutmann's vision and strategy to connect Penn to the world and the world to Penn. And at a time when the world is facing unprecedented uncertainty, having you back, Ambassador Gutmann, feels like a reassuring full circle moment. So thank you again for being here. President Jameson will do the formal introductions in just a moment, so let me just say a few words about him. Dr. Larry Jameson is the 10th president of the University of Pennsylvania. He was appointed in March 2025 after serving as interim president since December of 2023. Before leading the university, he spent over a decade as the executive vice president of the University of Pennsylvania Health System and dean of the Raymond and Ruth Perlman School of Medicine, guiding Penn Medicine's growth in education, research, and patient care. President Jameson is deeply committed to the university's values and its tradition of excellence, especially in fostering strong connections with alumni, donors, volunteer leaders, and all those who support Penn's mission. We are honored to have President Jameson with us today. Before we kick off, let me remind you that we'll be doing written questions for the Q&A part of this event because there are so many of you here and so many people online. So everyone should have a pen and paper on or near your chair. And about halfway through the event, someone will collect them at the sides. So think of your questions, write them down, and hand them to the sides. And if you're online, please use the Q&A feature. It's a great pleasure to host this event today. As I think many of you know, Benjamin Franklin was not only the founder of the University of Pennsylvania, but he was the first ambassador of the United States. And with that spirit in mind, it's really my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jameson to the stage to introduce our event formally.
Well, Professor Weisberg, thanks so much for hosting this event in Perry Worldhouse. You really exemplify so much of what is great about Perry Worldhouse with your global interests and your leadership, a terrific Penn citizen. So I have the privilege to introduce the dream team. We've got two ambassadors and a nationally and internationally recognized correspondent. So Perry Worldhouse has really put Penn on the map for its global interests. All you have to do is look recently at the impact of COVID, the news cycle, or how rapidly the news about tariffs has reshaped global enterprise and thinking to realize how interconnected the world is. And so it's a privilege to introduce first our former president, Amy Gutmann, also a former ambassador to Germany. President Gutmann was the longest serving president of the University of Pennsylvania for 18 years. She launched the landmark Penn Compact. Among many features, inclusion, innovation, and impact, but also a focus on local activities as well as engaging globally. She's a moral and political philosopher, appointed in two different schools at the University of Pennsylvania, the School of Arts and Sciences, as well as the Annenberg School, and we're so happy to welcome her back to Penn as a faculty member. Our second participant is going to be David Cohen. David Cohen is the recent ambassador to Canada. A partner to President Gutmann during those 18 years. He was the chair of our board of trustees. He's also an architect of the governance of Penn Medicine, which is very close to my heart and really is behind so much of the success that we've seen with Penn Medicine. David, of course, is a citizen of this city of Philadelphia. He's touched almost every aspect of the life in Philadelphia. He was an executive at Comcast for many years, served as a partner at Ballard Spahr, chaired that group, and so we're delighted to have two ambassadors carrying on the tradition of Benjamin Franklin, as you referenced. And then finally, to moderate the discussion, we've got Andrea Mitchell, not only a trailblazing journalist, but a trusted journalist, somebody who has seen and championed the news coverage of every presidential election since 1980. She's interviewed innumerable world leaders, continues active until today, and notably, she's a Penn alum. She's also a trustee emeritus, and she's supported so many different things at the University of Pennsylvania, including the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy. So I'd now like to welcome these three participants to the stage.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you so much, President Jameson. It is so wonderful to be here. I like to think of this extraordinary place as the house that Amy and David built. With a lot of vision and hard work and support. But this has been built really by all of you and by the wonderful people who've led it. And it's a place I just love to come to whenever I'm on campus. So thank you for inviting me back. We come at a time when really the world has been transformed. And we are, challenging, fighting with our closest neighbor and ally, Canada, and starting a trade war that doesn't help anyone in terms of what's now happening, the repercussions across the border, on both sides of the border, and also embracing Russia over Ukraine, going against our NATO ally and our most important ally in Europe of all, which is Germany. So we could not be better positioned to have two incredible diplomats who have just returned from their tours of duty, but also the people with the world experience in so many different fields to come here and talk about all of this today. So thank you to Dr. Gutmann. Thank you to David Cohen. First, let's talk about the role of ambassadors and the importance of alliances. Amy, if you want to go first.
Okay, the role of ambassadors and the importance of alliances. I'll answer, at least begin to answer this big question in a small space. So I'll give you an example, namely in the back seat of an armored Audi A8 tearing down the German Autobahn from Berlin to Munich in mid-February 2022. And I mean tearing. I looked at the speedometer, 180 kilometers per hour. My math background is 112 miles an hour. And we made it with barely any time to spare. That's the moral of this little story, which is there really isn't time to spare these days. So what was my mission? This was my mission as U.S. ambassador to Germany. I had just been credentialed in Germany after being confirmed in the U.S. My mission was to convince German Chancellor Scholz, along with Vice President Harris and Secretary of State Blinken, of what President Biden rightly felt incredibly strongly about, which is that we had reliable intelligence, which we shared with the Germans and all of our major allies, that President for Life, Putin, was about to launch a major attack on Ukraine, the first major ground war in Europe since World War II. And my mission was to convince the Chancellor and his whole cabinet to prepare for this and ally with us, which would be a sea change for Germany. It meant, and our message was not subtle, because what Putin was doing was not subtle. Our message was end your reliance on Russian gas and oil and build your military. That was two of the primary messages. There were others. Why? Because otherwise, Putin has you in a position that for the interests, your interests and ours as a democratic country, he can blackmail you into neutrality in a war that will be close to you, but a war that won't stop if Putin conquers Ukraine. It will go on and on. And we actually did that. A week later, Putin invaded Ukraine, as our intelligence had informed everybody that he would. We wished it wasn't so, but it was. Wishes do not make good plans. And then 3 days after that, Chancellor Scholz said, we are ending Nord Stream 2, ending our reliance on Russian gas and oil. We are building our military. We had $100+ billion, 100 billion euros that will go into building our military, will ramp up, as they did. They ramped up their defense and their contribution to NATO within a year to over 2%, and they turned out from being one of the weakest large powers in the world to being the second largest contributor to Ukraine's humanitarian, military, and economic aid, second only to the US. And all of the EU has contributed even more than the US. That's part of what an ambassador does. That's what sometimes is called soft diplomacy, but it ends up with really hard results. Military aid, humanitarian aid. Germany has become the largest home for Ukrainian refugees, over 1 million. And that is just an incredibly important part of what we do. I'll conclude by simply saying that having allies and knowing who your allies are is incredibly important for the United States. If we did not have Germany as an ally, if we did not have the Europeans generally as allies, we would not be able to effectively deal with authoritarians. Let's call them what they are, autocrats, like Putin, like Xi, and others. And among our closest allies, I will hand this off, is Canada. I'll hand it off to David to tell the story of Canada. But let me just say one thing before I do. Being U.S. ambassador to Germany is very important on the world stage for the United States, right? Because Germany is the largest economic power in Europe, and we do a tremendous amount of trade and investment and so on. But it's also, very important for me personally, because it shows, and I want to leave you with this message, it shows how much diplomacy can do in one generation. My father, Kurt Gutmann, escaped from Nazi Germany in 1934, and he got his whole family out in 37 to 39. Germany was our arch enemy then. I needn't tell, if you know anything about history, you know that. Germany has become, because of the Marshall Plan, because of the great diplomacy of presidents and secretary of state and of career diplomats, it's become such a strong ally that it is mourning as much as any American is mourning when somebody in America, especially the president of America, calls Ukraine, the Ukrainian president, a dictator and doesn't call Putin one, or blames Ukraine for starting a war when Putin actually was the clear aggressor. But nothing like that's happening about Canada, right?
Let me pick up on that, because the territorial ambition, if you will, was first taken as a joke, both in Canada and the U.S., for Canada to be the 51st state. The insult to Prime Minister Trudeau welcoming him to Mar-a-Lago as governor, as though he were just another, governor of a state. But David, our closest ally, a car goes across the border 20, 30 times to become fabricated. Our economies are completely integrated. Our immigration issues were non-existent and still are if you look at the facts. And I have a brother, a Penn graduate, who is a dual citizen living in Canada, and my whole family is up there. So I feel this very, very strongly. And I have to tell you, when David completed his tour, and you should know that both of these ambassadors were so distinguished in their service. I'll get into more of some of those details in a minute. But when David was celebrated at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, he was more traveled. He had been east to west, north to south, or south to north, which is the Arctic, freezing to make sure that he was in every part of the country. He was the most traveled ambassador, and the territory is just enormous, as you can imagine. So we're talking about the scale of his his travel and his investment, diplomatically, I should say, and to embrace all of the cultures, and there are many in Canada, which is, one of the reasons why it is such a challenging post. But tell us about the reaction to being patronized, ridiculed as the 51st state, then being hit with tariffs that completely misstate the economic calculations. We're very close to Huntsman Hall. You don't have to go to Wharton to figure out that a trade deficit is not just goods, it's also services, and that we are completely miscalculating the numbers here. And it all started with claims about illegal immigration and fentanyl, which is not a problem on the northern border. But that's what you've faced in the last the last year or so.
Right. So I think between what Amy said and what you said, you've covered 75% of what the job of ambassador is. So if I pull the lens back, what people may not realize is that at least the U.S. ambassador is the president's personal representative to the host country, and he or she is the highest-ranking United States official in that country at any time, except when the president is present. Even when the vice president visits, on a protocol basis, the U.S. ambassador ranks ahead of the vice president of the United States. So that puts you in a unique position to be able to represent the president's interests, the country's interests, and it's a two-way representation. It's communicating United States messages to the host country, but it is communicating host country messages back to the United States. And I had no training in this. I'd never done this before. Don't think I'm ever doing it again. A nice one-and-done responsibility. But one of the things I learned is that because of that position, I had a unique status and stature with the Canadian public, which is one of the reasons why I traveled as much as I did and became known by literally tens of thousands of Canadians on a personal basis, because I could then have real personal conversations to be able to articulate what Canada was feeling. And I still have the ability to do that. Not that anyone wants to listen to me anymore about what that means. And so, by the way, the other 25%, which I want to mention, which I know is true for Amy as well, but for countries like Germany and Canada that have large diplomatic missions. In Canada, about 1,500 people on my team in an embassy and 7 consulates. And one of the major responsibilities of ambassador is to have responsibility for those people, for all those diplomats, to oversee all of their work, to build their morale, to deal with to deal with their issues and their concerns. This is something that outlives your service as ambassador. I was saying up in the green room, I had 3 phone calls last night from people who used to be on my team in the Canadian Embassy and team, because one thing that hasn't made the news yet is that there is a new early retirement offer for the entire Department of Homeland Security in anticipation of yet to be announced in specificity, but an anticipated 10,000 layoffs in the Department of Homeland Security. And I got 3 calls from people who work for the Department of Homeland Security in Canada seeking my advice whether they should accept this early retirement offer, which, by the way, was made 2 days ago, and the deadline was midnight last night. So that's a responsibility that sort of continues. It doesn't go away when you resign as ambassador, not if you're a human being. So Andrea, I put that, the management of your people, responsibility of your people, the substantive leadership of what's going on in the country, two-way communication from our President, Secretary of State to the host country, and from the host country back to the White House, the NSC, the relevant agencies. I think that's sort of gives you a sense of the scope of the responsibility of an ambassador. So in terms of the reaction, Andrea, to what you were talking about, it has been negative. I think from a Canadian perspective, and it's interesting, it's almost more the 51st state rhetoric than the tariffs, because it's something that Canadians have taken very personally. One of the things I've learned in my travels around Canada is that this has been a repetitive theme of the United States vis-a-vis Canada, which is annexing Canada. It started, believe it or not, in the mid-18th century. And since I'm at Penn, I will tell you that none other than Ben Franklin was actually part of the genesis of this with his famous cartoon, which was designed not to fight against British rule, not to unite the colonies against the British, but to unite the colonies against the French, and in particular Canada. And so it started then. You can go to the earliest days of the Revolutionary War when we invaded Quebec. Didn't go very well for the United States. That was not a war that they won. But then you can roll forward into the War of 1812 and the contentions that existed between French Canada and the United States. You can roll forward into the early 20th century when a whole dispute around free trade and President Taft announced free trade agreement. There were those who wanted to derail it, and the way they decided to derail it was, let's stir up antipathy in Canada toward the United States. Let's talk about annexing Canada. So they passed a resolution in the House of Representatives to open negotiations on annexation of Canada, which in fact led to a change in the Canadian government from the Liberal government to the Conservative government in the 1911 elections. So this is a sore spot for Canada. They don't like the United States talking about taking them over. My first tour through the Canadian Museum of History, I noticed there was a huge exhibit on the way in which Canada has had to organize itself to protect against the United States invasion and taking over of Canada. So Donald Trump does a lot of things wrong. But one of the things he gets right is he knows vulnerabilities. He knows how to needle people and countries. And talking about Canada being the 51st state, I believe he knew how sensitive Canada would be to this, how he would get under the skin of Canadians and Canadian leaders as a result of talking about it. So Amy and I were talking as we were talking about this program, and I think both of our reluctance still have this diplomatic bone in my body that it's not my job to criticize the President of the United States, no matter who he is, although I'm a lot freer to do so now.
Speak for yourself,
I'm a lot freer to do so now than when I was actually serving as the ambassador. But predicting why Donald Trump does what he does is a very dangerous thing to do. But I think you can look at that, Andrea, and say that the real genesis of that, I think, was personal antipathy between Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau. And he knew this would get under his skin. He knew this would be needling him. He knew he was being disrespectful to Prime Minister Trudeau in doing this, and I think that is a big motivation of that. And one of the reasons I say that is because now the new Prime Minister, if you will, of Canada has had one conversation with Donald Trump. And in that conversation, he pushed back hard, according to his readout of the conversation, against Canada as a 51st state. And President Trump's readout said the same thing. And what was interesting is that since that conversation, Donald Trump has not mentioned Canada as a 51st state again, which is a typical reaction of a bully, which is if you want to stop a bully, you got to punch the bully in the nose. You got to push back directly, and I think Mark Carney did that privately, did that in the best possible way. And you can see that the reaction from President Trump has to stop that conversation as one of the many things that he has done that are not good for the U.S.-Canada relationship.
Well, and in fact, the political response, of course, was to completely flip the political sentiment in terms of the political parties in a campaign year in Canada. So Mark Carney would not be the Prime Minister, most likely, a former central banker in both Canada, and because of his expertise, he was also the Bank of England, the central banker in the UK, in England, because he probably would never have been selected. There was so much antipathy by then to the Trudeau leadership that most likely.
So, Andrea, what might be interesting when the history is written, this may be, and again, the election is in another 2 weeks, so we won't know what the ultimate Prime Minister will be, but this may be the second time in history that the United States weighing in on an issue of annexation of Canada has flipped party control in the Canadian Parliament. 1911, Liberal to Conservative. Here, it's not a flip because the Liberals are in control, but Conservatives were way ahead in the polls and were assumed to be a slam dunk winner in the next election when it took place, and it sure looks today, hesitate to predict that because who knows what happens in 2 weeks, like there could be a flip and the Liberals could remain in control.
I want to pick up on what you both are expressing about the importance of alliances, and what we see now, especially in Europe, and Germany is the most important of the countries in Europe, militarily, in being a neighbor, of course, of Russia, and standing up in NATO. It's the core of NATO. Now, I was in Munich at the security conference when Amy was barreling down the Autobahn to arrive, just credentialed and accepted by the president in Berlin, and coming to Munich, where the international world was gathered, and Zelensky was there. And that's where Zelensky, with Amy and the other leaders, the other Americans, were telling him the cold facts. He had to be persuaded that this invasion was imminent. It was only days later. And if you recall, he was offered to be flown back because they were so afraid that his plane would be shot down by a Russian missile. And he was escorted, at least. There was a military escort. But and all of that was hugely sensitive. But just to show you how current this is, where we are today. Just yesterday in the Oval Office, I want to quote from what the president said, because he was asked about Zelensky's latest request to buy Patriot missiles. He was sitting with President Bukele from El Salvador, and the dominant issue, of course, was the demand, the legal demand, and the order by the Supreme Court, although it was a little ambiguous in the way it was supposed to be executed, but the order by the Supreme Court that the administration find some way to facilitate the return to the U.S. of Mr. Abrego Garcia, who was, according to the acknowledgement of the administration, mistakenly sent to this prison, with no notice from Maryland. So he was asked about Zelensky in a very long exchange, and he said, he's always looking to purchase missiles. Listen, when you start a war, you got to know that you can win the war, right? You don't start a war against somebody that's 20 times your size and then hope that people give you some missiles. So the question was about a purchase by Zelensky, and it turned into, when you start a war, well, we all were there when Russia invaded. So just how challenging was it for you in Europe as an ambassador of the United States, leaving NATO when the other countries have not spent enough on their contributions, and then a year ago, on basically the orders of candidate Donald Trump, the Senate froze for months the funding, and we were back in Munich, and Zelensky was saying, we were going to have to retreat. And that was the turning point in the war. That was a war that maybe could have been won, or a better negotiating position could have been achieved. But for 3 or 4 months, the supplemental was not approved. And you're the U.S. ambassador having to, explain this is a man who's not yet president, but had persuaded the Republicans in the Republican-led Senate then to hold up all funding.
Look, when I got there, and so Andrea and I met in my new role, right, 3 times in the Munich Security Conference. The first time we've already talked about, and there was this huge challenge. And one of the things that you recognize as an ambassador is not only are you the most powerful American in the country and so on, but the press just loves to talk to you. And so the press would ask me what Andrea asked me. Coincidentally, she's a reporter too, a great one at that. And the first thing I said was, every challenge is an opportunity. So the challenge was to get the Europeans to do more for NATO. Because the fact was, they were not doing, Germany was not doing as much as it could and should and so on. And I said, every challenge is an opportunity. And the first thing, like every reporter in the room, this was in our beautiful conference room, Zach Layton was there in all likelihood. He was my senior advisor. Welcome, Zach. They said the first reaction was, that's so American. Right? Every challenge is an opportunity, but it's true. It was this huge opportunity. I had around my table in the residence, the size of the table like I've never actually had in any home of mine, even the Penn president's home. I had, in one dinner, I had 10% of the US Senate, right? Republicans and Democrats alike, and they were all avidly in support of Ukraine. I want to say one other thing about this challenge. And it totally intersects. It's as if David and I were leading parallel in parallel, we were coordinating, even though we weren't coordinating. So it was not only the support of Ukraine and making sure that President for Life Putin doesn't get away with his aggression, because he too is a bully, and if you stand up to him, he, more or less backs down. Remember, we had no reason to believe, this is a David versus Goliath story, no reason to believe that Zelensky and Ukraine could last a week. They were so weak, and yet the first initiative was to take over Kyiv, and it absolutely failed, and Kyiv is secure as long as we Americans don't screw that up. So when Congress stalled, it was a diplomatic challenge, but I knew we had an administration that was on the right side. What? The right side of democracy. Remember, as president of Penn, I had this, as Larry so kindly said, this Penn Compact, which was inclusion, innovation, impact. The first thing I did as ambassador was create a new compact. This was a compact for the State Department in Germany, and it was called SAID. We will do what we said we were going to do. S is for to support our staff, A is to advance our alliances, I is to innovate inclusively, I will not retract that word, and D is to defend our democracy. And that's what we did. Fast forward to a few months ago, weeks ago, not more than a few months ago. And this is the parallel between what happened in Canada and what happened in Germany. You may or may not recall, it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here. You may or may not recall that Elon Musk went to Germany and made a point of meeting with the leaders of only one party, the party that has been declared by German courts to have far extremist elements, the party that allies with Russia, hates the United States, and has called the Holocaust, and I quote the translation from German, a speck of poop in the larger history, glorious history of Germany. It is called the remembrance culture, a guilt cult. It has spouted anti-Americanism. And then Vice President Vance came and he doubled down on it at the Munich Security Conference. That would have been the fourth one, but I was not there. Sick joke, I got a call last night asking me there is no ambassador to Germany. Would I consider it? No, I didn't. But here's what happened. Here's what happened. By all accounts, and of course this is a counterfactual, but the AfD, which is this party, the Alternative for Germany, for Deutschland, was rising in the polls. This was right before the German election that our diplomats did it, right? And they went down. So they've been pretty much, at this point, capped at around 20, 21%, which is terrifying, it's frightening, it's horrifying for Germany. And what do you do when something's terrifying, horrifying, and objectively so? You create an alliance among rival parties, opponents but not enemies. So the rival parties in Germany all have what they call a firewall against the AfD. Vance and Musk were there to excoriate the Germans, to let down that firewall. Nothing could be more horrifying for Germans to have their greatest ally since World War II, the ally that 80% of Germans will tell you immediately saved us from the Nazis, saved us from our worst selves. Their greatest ally with the neo-Nazi party. And that is something that, as David said about the 51st state, that is something that's going to take a lot of diplomacy and a big sea change in our politics at the top for the Germans to get over.
Well, I was in Munich that day, and I was with the congressional delegation, a bipartisan delegation, the largest that had ever attended the Munich conference. And to a person, when J.D. Vance gave that speech, which inflamed the German public, it inflamed the Republican senators. They won't say so publicly, but I was sitting in the room when they came back from that speech, and it was downstairs in the auditorium, in the larger hall, and every one of them, with maybe one exception, you can guess which Republican senator that was, I'm talking committee chairs who helped confirm some very controversial cabinet choices.
But don't you think you have to say it publicly? I'm of the, and I've said this over and over again, silence in these cases is complicity
as a
with
journalist,
injustice.
of course, but it was not, they were speaking, in an off-the-record context, very openly among each other. I was there as a guest, and I couldn't.
Oh, no, I understand that.
But,
I wasn't saying you, I was saying that.
But they have not spoken out. And we've seen, one of them criticized the speech, sort of, but no, they haven't. And David, when you see this rise in right-wing politics in Europe, and it does infect NATO and other relationships, it affects Canada, you're a political, I'd say, observer, expert in the past. You've known American politics. We are seeding it. I mean, Rick Grinnell, one of Amy's predecessors in Germany, met with the right-wing politicians before and alienated Angela Merkel, and is now in this administration as a special envoy. So how does this rise in, Viktor Orban being welcomed here by the Conservative Political Action Committee and being celebrated, and these intersections among foreign right-wing parties and what is happening here in America? How concerning do you think that we should be about that?
So I think it's a huge concern. It should be an even larger concern. Let's just put it that way. I am of the view, by the way, I don't like lines being drawn in the sand, as has happened in Canada and elsewhere, that friendships are irrevocably broken, that the friendship with between the United States and Canada is over, or statements that there is irreparable injury to the United States-Germany relationship. I was in Canada in late 2021 when there was a sense that the Canada-U.S. relationship had been irreparably broken, that the trust that had been built over 100 years had been broken by the first Trump administration. I didn't accept that, I didn't believe that, and it took most of an entire 4 years to rebuild that trust again, and it's been torn down in 3 months, which just goes to show you the temporal nature of these things. So I don't give up on the future here, but it really goes to what Amy was said, and she said at the beginning, she said it again, which is the importance of alliances, because it's alliances that keep the world together. It's not a bilateral squabble between President Trump representing the most powerful nation on the earth and every other country that used to be our friend. That's not what keeps the world ticking. It is alliances, and what the rise in these right-wing these I'll just call them right-wing reactionary populist movements, the way to combat them is through alliances of like-minded countries, whether the president of those countries are with us or not. There are enough leaders in the United States, there are enough leaders in Germany, there are enough leaders in the EU, there are enough leaders in Canada that still believe in what the U.S.-led alliance stands for. Democracy, freedom, equality, even diversity and inclusion, whether you're allowed to use those terms or not. And it's those values, which I always used to point out in Canada, values that were born here in Philadelphia 249 and a half years ago. So I always felt I had a little bit more standing to talk about them and to talk about my belief in them, because I was from Philadelphia. Those values endure. And when things happen like what they're happening, it's a time for alliances to be even more important and for people to look for even more ways to work together and to preserve those alliances and not to let a Donald Trump or a Putin or any of these other right-wing movements take over the conversation and the dialogue.
Can I just build on that? Because I think it's such an important point for us. We are an agency, and one of the things I did as ambassador in Germany is start an initiative called Stand Up and Speak Out for democracy, against anti-Semitism, against Islamophobia, against all forms of hatred, right? Stand up and speak out. And that was, we partnered with, this was a partnership with civil society in Germany. with everything from high school students, so I would meet with thousands of them. I met with 2,000 or more high school students. And we did so much together. That is going to last, no matter who, as David said, who is president. Those kinds of bonds, the Fulbright program between US and Germany and Europe and all over.
Which has been zeroed out.
Yes, but there are so many, let's do a little
And
upbeat
the
here.
Fulbright graduates have not been zeroed out.
Right, the Fulbright graduates have voice. We all have voice. And we can use it because when you're an ambassador or when you go and live for any amount of time in another country, you will see how much America, what America stands for is revered in the world. We are a country that, as everybody from Ronald Reagan to Joe Biden and, before Reagan, John F. Kennedy, we are a country united by these constitutional ideals of liberty and justice for all towards a more perfect union. We'll never be perfect, and we're far from it even before this administration. But we have to speak for those ideals. We really, all of us, that's my, I can't come, I still have this ambassador, which is probably also like the president of Penn, too. When Larry asks you for something, say yes, right? You should always have an ask, and my only ask is to speak your values, because that's what makes America great, and it's what our Canadian and German partners and small a allies really admire and want to emulate, and so they'll pick up. They can't do without us, and we can't do without them. Over to you.
Well, that's why I think people are so concerned about students being picked up off the streets and not having, access to a lawyer and not being able to call home. The lack of due process, which is fundamental to our system, and now a potential challenge to a Supreme Court decision, which is still, the slow walking with what's happening to immigrants. They just canceled a program, a Biden program, where hundreds of thousands of people were told to sign up for an appointment and you could get temporary status here as long as you had a green card and had, a family of support. And that was canceled overnight. And they've been given 7 days to leave. And that's the kind of notification. David, you talked about 1,500 people on the team and the embassy, which is a large family in a lot of ways. You're still getting calls from some homeland people there. I want to ask you about the role of envoys, because all presidents have had envoys, now more than any, I think you could say. And we've just had the experience of Mr. Witkoff, who has the virtue of really knowing Donald Trump's desires and what his boundaries are, and so that is a good asset for him. But he's now had 3 meetings with Vladimir Putin. There's no note-taker. He went from the Putin meeting to our first meeting with the Iranians since 2018, when Trump in his first term withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal at a pivotal time when Iran is weaker militarily than it's ever been, and economically, and is asking for these meetings, wanting to engage, but also wanting to slow walk it and try to wait this one out, as has been the past. I covered all of the Iran talks. But also Witkoff then debriefing Netanyahu's people and dealing with the latest Hamas offer to release Idan Alexander, the last surviving American, while Israel is reoccupying Gaza. So there are, as an ambassador, how do you assess the role of envoys who come with a very different portfolio and expertise and a certain skill set, perhaps as negotiators, but that's taking on the 3 biggest crises right now on the global stage?
So everything is a matter of degree. There are clearly, one of the major differences between an envoy and the Secretary of State or high-ranking diplomats, ambassadors for that matter, is that envoys don't go through Senate confirmation. So they are almost by definition more ad hoc than a Senate-confirmed appointee. And I'm not sure I would have said this before I was ambassador, but I will say for me, and I think Amy agrees with this, being Senate-confirmed gives you a cachet, a special cachet and special clout within your host country that an envoy just doesn't and can't have. But there can be roles for envoys. I mean, Joe Biden had a lot of envoys too. And, you know, for example, in the anti-Semitism space, the earliest voices on anti-Semitism were envoys. They weren't ambassadors. So it's a matter of degree. And as you, in your question, as you explain what Steve Witkoff has been up to, and the amount of empowerment that he's been granted, and the lack of transparency around what it is that he's doing, and the apparent disconnectedness from the rest of the diplomatic and foreign policy personnel and apparatus of the executive branch, I think the risk there is that it's gone too far, that it's too extreme a use of the envoy apparatus. But I wouldn't condemn across the board the use of envoys.
And Deborah Lipstadt is the envoy for anti-Semitism, and she has the rank of ambassador. So there are envoys and there are envoys. But here's what I think, building on what David said very briefly, what never happened to me, and I doubt if it ever happened to David, but has happened over and over again in this administration, is that I am, in the case of an advisor to the Trump administration, talking about tariffs while the tariff policy was changed, and he didn't know about it. Every time I was speaking and working to advance American values and interests in Germany, because that's ultimately our job, right? I knew what the administration I was working for and with stood for in any given time. I was never, ever blindsided. And I also felt, because I asked people to stand up and speak out, I always felt I could stand up and speak out. And when my wonderful team at the embassy and our 5 consulates would say, you know, we really think you should do this, but we are worried that they may not like it in the State Department, I would say, I will have your back, you have my back. Don't worry. If they don't like it, they can fire me. Well, they never did, but I felt that that's what I had to do. And sometimes they were hard discussions, but I was never blindsided. And that's part of working as a team. But we have questions.
We have some questions, so I want to get some of our questions in. Here's a question, David Cohen, from a current junior at Penn, first-generation American. America is, to me, an idea of democracy, freedom, and leadership. As an ambassador, how do you communicate not only policy decisions, but the ideas that the U.S. embodies? And do you seek to do that?
Great question.
So it is a great question. And I don't think Amy or I had formal training in what you were supposed to do as an ambassador. There is ambassador school, which is you get a nice surface treatment, but everything else is instinct. And my instinct was that one of the most powerful things that I could do was to talk about what America stood for and what our values were. And I took every opportunity to do so everywhere I could in the country. And it was in a country like Canada, was incredibly well received, but really an important message to be able to communicate, and was a big part of rebuilding the trust and relationship between the United States and Canada that really had been disrupted, at least, if not more than that, in the first 4 years of Donald Trump as president, because it's a message that resonated. And I did view it as part of my job to constantly remind Canadians about what the United States stood for and what Joe Biden stood for and what the diplomatic representatives of the United States believed and stood for in Canada was one of my most important messages, and a message that I think was extremely well received throughout the term of my service in Canada. And I hear about it now, because I hear about it from Canadians telling me, does this guy believe in all that?
Yeah.
I mean, basically language almost exactly like that. So I do think it's an important part of the job and an important part of representing the country, not just the issues that may be on the agenda of the president, but the values of the country and what the country stands for.
Dr. Gutmann, this question is, how should universities lobby the current administration in regards to the attacks on scientific research to maintain American innovation and competitiveness when this administration is bent on punishing these elite institutions over DEI and the Palestinian protests?
Small question, yes.
But let me put it in the context of Harvard. Because
so let me just say that, because it is a huge question, and I don't pretend to be sitting in the chair that President Jameson is sitting in, but I do applaud his leadership and that of all universities that are standing firm for our values. Here's my quick answer to a huge question, but I think I'll go straight to the point. Universities stand for freedom of inquiry, the pursuit of knowledge, the preservation, creation, and dissemination of truth according to the best academic standards of inquiry and so on. We also contribute a tremendous amount to the prosperity and the innovation and the opportunity of Americans, and the health and the safety of Americans. I'm a first-generation college graduate. I didn't understand the research mission of a university growing up. It's very hard for people who are not part of this to understand it. What people do understand is standing up for freedom. And so last night, I wrote 2 paragraphs which 40 former university presidents signed on to in a matter of an hour, basically saying to this administration, what you're doing is against the values of our country and our colleges and universities. That I don't think I'm going to change this administration's mind. What I do think I can do, and depending on where you sit, you can do in different ways, is I can speak what I take to be the best values of this university. I can say that publicly, and as David has said, how important allies are, do it in partnership with as many other people. And the people who've signed on to this are from Holy Cross University, Spelman College, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, University of Michigan, you name it. It's the widest range, Haverford, the widest range of American colleges and universities. And we stand for these are American values as they're instituted in the colleges and universities. But as you will appreciate, we are not majoritarian institutions. We don't take a vote on what causes climate change. We don't take a vote on what economists think is good and bad tariff policy, right? We don't take a vote on what is good art or music. So we're going to always be slightly askew of the majority. And so when people say to me, you're never going to convince, by saying this, I say, of course I'm not. But if I have a voice, you have a voice, we all have voices, and the more informed, the better. And we should be self-critical. So I want to just say that there are things we haven't done well. And Penn has, put together task forces to acknowledge that and to respond to that. And that's great. I'm a scholar of democracy. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote this wonderful book, Democracy in America, which he was just stunned at the number of independent associations. Everybody in the US likes to join a club. That's true at Penn, right? Everybody wants to join multiple clubs. And that's a glory. That's part of our freedom. So I think we speak what it is that universities do for our prosperity, for our economy, and we defend their right to do them against violations of due process and law and the Constitution, recognizing that we won't win all the time, but we sure, to channel my Brooklyn origins, we ain't giving up.
And I think on that, yes, David, you can bring us home here.
So by the way, thank you, Amy, for continuing to exercise leadership in the retired university president community, because I do think it's important for these voices not to go silent. I also quote Elie Wiesel all the time that silence is complicity and we cannot afford to be silenced. There's no doubt about that. But because we talked about this when you were president, I was chair of the board, the American university community, the Ivy League, the prestigious colleges and universities in America do suffer from a bit of hubris in sometimes thinking that the entire world rotates around them, and it does not. And these voices may not be the best voices to push back on what is a symptom of a message and an attitude of autocracy and of one-size-fits-all that is what this administration is all about. And whether it's law firms, and they may not be the best voices either, but it's the same. But it is the same voice that is coming down on big law firms, colleges and universities. But it's
and the judiciary.
So the judiciary, which may not be able to speak out, but retired members of the judiciary may be able to speak out. You never know. Chief Justice Roberts spoke out about the inappropriateness of threatening impeachment of judges doing their jobs. I do think that colleges and universities are particularly great at putting together coalitions and collaborations, and I hope that there's a lot of energy being placed on building more voices than just the colleges and universities. And my other caution is, I just listened to the colleges and universities you listed. I didn't hear Brigham Young, University of Florida, University of Georgia, and you should go and you should take out a map of the United States and put pins on the map of the colleges and universities that are signing on to this, and I will bet you that they are disproportionately Northeast, West Coast, non-Republican, Trump-oriented places, and yet I think research institutions like University of Texas are just as worried about this, or should be just as worried about this, and I think we need to be careful in building a coalition in voices that we are being as broad as possible and that we're not just doing the usual suspects, but really trying to create a cacophony of different voices who are concerned about this direction of the country, but who share the desire for the values that we're all talking about.
Well, I think on that note, I just want to thank both of you for your public service. I want to thank this wonderful audience, both here and online, and the people who ask questions, and for the Perry World House, which is just such a great civic enterprise as a part of it.
Andrea, we want to thank you for your excellent moderation today and for coming back to campus, and we hope to see you more often. It's really always a great pleasure to have you. And to Ambassador Cohen, Ambassador Gutmann, thank you for joining us stage today. Thanks you to all of the audience. Really important for you to be here to do these kinds of events. I just want to note that tomorrow at 4 p.m., Her Excellency Amy Pope, who is the Director General of the International Organization of Migration, will be speaking here. So if you want to continue thinking about diplomacy, and in particular thinking about it in the multilateral system, I invite you to join us. So let's again give a round of applause for our panel.